All right, so our last panel today is a fireside chat, even though we don't have a real fire here. I really wish we had one because it's kind of cold. So first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today and sharing your work with us. The reason we have this chat at the end is that each of you studied the topic misinformation and marginalization from a different but intersecting angles. So we think it'd be interesting to bring everybody together and in the hope that we will further bring home some important points that we have been discussing today. So first, I want to come back to a point made by Dr. Banet-Weiser during her keynote, which is that we often talk about post-truth in our discipline, and but we don't often talk about post-truth for whom, and the fact that for some marginalized groups, truth has always been in crisis, right? So I want to ask our panel hosts, and maybe Dr. Banet-Weiser will add something too, whether you think post-truth is a good or generative descriptor of the current information environment, and based on your research from your perspective. Hope that makes sense.
Want me to start? I'm happy to
Yeah,
start.
you can start. I would love that.
No. I actually don't think that we all know posts are notoriously problematic, postmodern, post-feminist. It implies that we are beyond something, rather than, and so it kind of implies a temporality. And I think that it's important to recognize that there are certain truth tellers in the contemporary moment whose truths are being questioned, and they're not used to being questioned because they have been designated as truth tellers, either because they're journalists and so they have a kind of an objectivity around them, or because they are political figures who have a certain kind of authenticity. And I'm not suggesting that that's not happening, but it's not a crisis of truth, because it is a crisis for these particular people who have been designated truth tellers by, kind of, we could talk about Enlightenment philosophy, Donna Haraway's, God trick. These are all reasons why they have been designated in this way. And so it seems to me to be really important to recognize that, for example, where is oh, she was on Zoom. Sorry. I was trying to figure out the woman who's, I think her name is Melissa Brown.
Yeah.
Melissa Brown, she's talking about the history of Black folks in medicine who have been not believed about pain, about illness, about, anything in terms of their own kind of their biopolitics. For centuries, because that justified white supremacy, it justified slavery, it justified experimentation. And so those histories, I think, are important to take into account. And that's why the post-truth, it sort of is ahistorical for me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my perspective on this, and the reason why I brought up this issue of trust, is that social media emerged into a space where that trust in institutions was already declining. Who knows if it, added to it, but the reason why social media became as popular as it did was because there was an orientation towards moving away from institutions as the source of truth and knowledge and trust, and a movement towards friends and family. We've seen how this kind of measurement of trust kind of tracks, and you see this start to rise and this start to decline, and social media starts to come up. What's happening with social media in particular is that we're seeing kind of two forms of logic, the social media logics and mass media logics start to kind of come together and clash. And the major issue facing platforms right now is that they're kind of being put in the middle to say, we need to reconcile. We need to figure out, who do we kind of come out in favor? Do we come out on the favor of these mass media logics, these media organizations that are saying, no, we are the bearers of truth, we are the bearers of knowledge, we produce good information, we have these ethics that we've developed? Or do we go towards users and the participatory logics that kind of fueled social media's rise? So along the same vein, no, I don't think we're in a post-truth era. What I think we're seeing is kind of clashes in the production of knowledge. At the moment.
I think we could say we're not in a post-truth era, but post-trust era. Maybe it's not a crisis of truth, but a crisis of trust. And yeah, I think that the common complaint is that social media somehow made us unable to recognize what is false and what is correct and what is true. But the other way to look at it is that what social media did is that they gave voice to so many people who were previously unheard. So we just have different narratives and different truths that we somehow need to incorporate into the public discourse. And like, I have many concrete examples from my fieldwork, like the female influencers that I worked with, that for like the majority of them, their sort of gateway to the disinformation spaces was some sort of bad experience with what they would call the mainstream, usually in the medical space. So for example, when they were not believed because they had a chronic issue and they were not believed by the doctors that something is wrong with them. And that's how they started to seek out these alternative truths, for example. So just as an example.
Yeah, I would agree with all the panelists. I think truth or even facticity as like a way to define dis or misinformation, I think it comes from maybe the intention of quantifying it because it's something easily measurable. But if you actually talk to people, and like I've had this in interviews both in the US and in India, and you ask people, just general social media users, to define what dis or misinformation means, their definition is much more inclusive. Their definition includes weaponized information that may or may not be factual, but is targeted at a certain community or is towards certain purposes or certain ends. And so I think kind of thinking about it just in terms of facticity or truth, I think has really limited us in a lot of ways. And it kind of, as we shift further away from that, and take to Alice's point when she was talking about this idea of critical disinformation studies and kind of recognizing that any information that is weaponized to harm certain communities could be classified as that. I think that is a much more inclusive way to think about it and a better way forward in terms of our research as well.
Can I just say one more thing that you just made me think of too, is that I think that if we focus on something like the truth, it feels quite unmalleable, quite kind of set in stone. And I think what you're talking about women in medicine who they weren't believed, right? And so they kind of, but they migrated over to a position on the right, about traditional. And I think that, oh, thank you. I think that this stuff, that the work that I've done on women in health and medicine, it's like, you know, in the 70s when the sort of women's health, kind of queer women's health, manifesto came out, Our Bodies, Ourselves, it was because doctors were not believing women. And so then to see that turn, and Rachel, I think you talked about this too, the trans exclusionary feminists in the UK all identify as lesbian feminists of the second wave or something like that, like Bindle or Kathleen Stock or whatever, you know, that there were positions on that would be considered more on the left and have migrated to the right. If we focus on the truth as this kind of, you know, immutable, position that we're all orienting towards, we can't take account of that movement, I think, and that movement is important.
Well, thank you so much. That was very illuminating. And so next, so part of the reason we as organizers decided to put together this symposium is that we feel there needs to be more attention being paid to marginalized groups when it comes to misinformation and related research fields. And I want to promote this kind of research. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about challenges we as researchers has encountered in trying to get this kind of research published and recognized and celebrated. So I'm wondering if each of you can talk about one issue or challenge you have encountered or witnessed in this struggle.
I can start first. I think methodologically, it is challenging, especially if you're doing research in kind of the more private spaces that I'm doing research in, where there is no direct access to data, which to me, I don't see that as a limitation, but often the way it gets framed is like, well, we can't study those private spaces because we don't have access to data. Like that's kind of how it's framed rather than being like, okay, like what are the other ways in which we can get at some of the issues happening there and talk to people about it. So I think methodologically, definitely like getting more qualitative work and more critically oriented work published in especially the misinformation studies space, which has often been dominated by quantitative kind of psychological perspectives, is definitely a challenge. I feel like most of the people who do that work are like in this room or we're on Zoom, and that's pretty much about it. And so I think that is definitely a challenge that I've faced, and kind of to the point of like these contextual factors that we've all been talking about, they only do come out through these methodological perspectives that are more qualitative or critically oriented. So I think it's kind of convincing people and like also getting into spaces where the people who are doing the more quantitative work are also reading your work and kind of building off of that. I think that definitely is a challenge, that we're not in a silo where we all agree about what it needs to be done, but then it's only amongst us and not kind of the wider field, I would say.
I think like everyone who has ever tried to publish something that is happening in like a small local language, like for example, Czech has encountered these issues. Like if you want to publish in big international journal, then the first question would always be, so why is this relevant for us? Whereas if your research is based in the US, you just don't have to, like, let's assume that it's relevant. I even had on a panel at a conference, like I had someone in the audience ask me, so if you are doing digital ethnography, so you can include, like, you know, it doesn't matter that, you know, in the Czech Republic, you can also focus on people elsewhere. And I was like, but I want to focus on what is happening in these, not only Czech and Slovak, but in these languages, because this is the issue that I'm talking about. But he didn't really understand why I'm interested. But yeah, I think, but it's not just, I'm sure that I'm not alone in this, that it's just this general bias in the academia that is still persistent.
I do research on platforms mostly, so I don't know if I directly face this as much. I will say within the platform governance space, there is an orientation towards research that tends to be based in Europe, based in the United States, and it's very difficult not very difficult. I'm going to promote something. We have a research network, the Platform Governance Research Network, that's trying to address this problem specifically. It's a global research network. CTAF is a part of it, where it's a connection between 25 organizations all over the world to try and address some of this problem. We run a yearly conference that's all online. It's done across multiple time zones. And the major challenge that we're facing there is ensuring linguistic diversity, because the default still, even in that context, is English. It takes a lot of funding to be able to do that. It takes a lot of work. And yeah, it's something that needs to be done.
Do you want me to talk about challenges? Do you want me to talk about
I guess I would say that I never really think of myself as doing misinformation studies. I you know, it's like so I think part of the challenge is both me recognizing that what I'm talking about is misinformation, but also and this isn't with anyone in this room, but it's a similar frustration as I have with the post-truth, that the myths of misinformation assumes that information was somehow pure and circulated freely, and there wasn't any disinformation or misinformation. And so it's become this thing that we all do need to study. It is damaging. It causes material violence, you know, so I'm not questioning that at all, but I think it is a challenge for us to not sort of reify that term as something that is new. I wrote a piece on misinformation and misogyny and asked, you know, in that piece, I said, what is the connection between the two misses here, right? That misogyny is in and of itself is misinformation, and about women, about non-binary bodies. And so that's not really a challenge in terms of publishing, but it is a challenge in terms of my thinking, how to figure out what it is, what it is that I study.
Yeah. Let's dwell on this kind of definitional issue a little bit. Like, I wonder if our other panelists have this like identity soul searching question about whether you're a misinformation scholar or not.
Wow, you just gave a lot more word to my thinking, but yes, it is an identity soul searching question.
I would say when I was asked to be a part of this, my immediate response was, I'm not a misinformation scholar. I study platform governance. So yeah, I mean, the way that I was kind of always taught up by Dana Boyd at Data Society was that like it's necessary to pay attention to the full frame to be able to do the kind of work that I do. But if I would not necessarily classify myself as a misinfo scholar.
I always call myself a social media and computer mediated communication scholar. And that I think using that term though is to get into certain spaces. And sometimes it kind of comes from frustration, or when you see those spaces kind of not recognizing certain contexts or certain platforms, you're like, okay, I need to reach these people and I need to talk to them in some kind of way so that they're alerted to the fact that these other things are happening in spaces they're not paying attention to. But it's that bind of like, then you do reify those terms, you do kind of reify those power structures and hierarchies in academia at the same time as kind of achieving your goal of like reaching those spaces. But again, that's another identity.
I'm not sure if I obviously I have an identity crisis, because who doesn't, but I think mine is mostly because I'm an anthropologist, but because of what I study, I mostly meet with media studies scholars or communication studies scholars or platform studies scholars. So that's where my identity crisis usually happens, that I don't know that many people who would use the same methodology, the same reflexivity in the research, and also who would need so much time to do field work in the misinformation studies area. So yeah, that's my identity crisis.
So here at CTAP, we care deeply about public scholarship, and one of the goals is to have a voice in policy making in technology, about technology. And so in this spirit, I would like to ask if each of you can say a few words about the policy implications of your work. I know it's very broad, but it's kind of on purpose.
Because I'm going it's Diana bringing the policy.
They have a policy center, but we're not a policy school, yes.
I work in a policy school, so I guess mine does have policy implications. Yeah, I mean, so my work, I generally study the development of content standards. And that's also why I kind of pull away from concepts like misinformation, because most of what I'm studying is how different stakeholders are interacting to try and affect and influence the development of content standards. A lot of that has to do with power arrangements, who has an ear to a massive company like a platform company. A lot of that looks at, how organizations are coordinating with each other and how they are kind of using that as a way to counter power as well. And then I look at it from the perspective of those who kind of lack power, those who end up being impacted by those decisions and might not have as much of an opportunity to impact them. I think policy in this field is a really complicated question because, again, coming back to this issue of trust, we don't trust media, we don't trust platforms. In the US especially, people do not necessarily trust government to make these distinctions or these sorts of decisions either. And what we're seeing kind of play out in this kind of policy space are people trying to kind of broadly create technology policy that's impacting platforms and how content is distributed that can be used for whatever aim they want, which is a little scary. And yeah, so my work impacts policy at kind of every single level, looking at it from that perspective, trying to understand who's going to benefit from these arrangements, but then also looking at it from the perspective of governance by platforms, how they are governing their own communities, and then how communities are governing each other.
You want me to go next? Or,
Sure.
my work probably has no policy. I'm just kidding. I mean, I hope that some of it does, but I will say that I've been asked to comment a lot on, because I work on young women and girls and media and social media in particular. So I've been asked to comment a lot on like Houseman. It was not what was her name? Hauser, the whistleblower for Facebook. Haugen. Sorry, Houseman. I'm somewhere named Houseman around here. Houseman. And I'm tired. But about social media, about Instagram causing low self-esteem in young women and girls. And my position on policy is that I would like policymakers to listen to a different conversation. I would like policy members to think about what other factors in a broad cultural environment may may encourage girls and young women to have low self-esteem, such as the fact that their reproductive rights have just been taken away from them, or that there's still not equal pay for equal work, that there are laws in place that are hampering now LGBTQI issues. I mean, so I'm always kind of pushing for that broader context of before we ask the policy question, or what can policy do? Like what is the sort of, the conjuncture that policy makes sense in the first place?
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly, there's a bunch of bills that are coming up that are targeting this specifically at the state level and federally. COSA is the biggest example where they are targeting very broadly online harms, opening up civil liability for platforms to get sued, and then online harms is being defined it is not being defined.
Yeah.
So it can be used by a Democrat that seems to believe that a social media company is causing low self-esteem. Or it can be used by a Republican congressman to attack people getting information about their LGBTQI identity or about reproductive rights.
Yeah. Kind of related to that, I know people in my life always joke that my brand is yelling about how the moral panic surrounding social media are kind of talked about in more public journalistic discourse. I trace a lot of this back to the film The Social Dilemma, and I can have a beer and tell you all about my thoughts about that. I've written about that film specifically as well. But I think when I think about my work in policy, I think it is kind of the question of how we talk about social media and how we talk about the harms of social media, the perceived harms, the actual harms, because these bills that we're talking about are a direct result of thinkings around how there's a simplistic problem of, you take social media away from anyone under the age of 16, their mental health will automatically, magically become better because everything else in the world is perfect, right? Like there's nothing, and specifically I've seen this a lot in these bills where they talk about, well, actually the problem is only social media with algorithms.
Oh my God.
And how if the algorithms were not there would be no harm and like everything would be fine. So I think I see my kind of work and more public scholarship as well as kind of general scholarship as like trying to improve our discourse about social media and trying to be more balanced. And I see my teaching work as really directed towards that. I think one of the main goals I have with my students when I teach them about technology and social media is, because a lot of them do come with that perspective. I was told by a student who's like, in high school, we were shamed for being on social media, and our teachers talked about how we were doing this to ourselves and harming our well-being because we were on social media. So I see both my teaching and my research as a way to kind of help challenge that and help improve how we talk about those things. But I can go on and on about this.
In his Twitter account.
That's my public scholarship.
Yeah, I think in terms of like policies regarding regulation of platforms and social media in general, European context is very different because we actually do have quite a complex legislation around it, like the DSA, the DMA. I guess you're familiar with it. But specifically regarding misinformation, I would actually agree with what you said. Like, I think my work should have policy implications, but it would need to be a completely different debate than the one that is currently happening. And specifically, again, in the Central Eastern European spaces, misinformation, disinformation, conspiracies are framed as a security issue and as like the hybrid war discourse. And this has obviously intensified since, again, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there's been a lot of very hasty regulations, for example, in the disinformation space. And I find myself oftentimes unable to participate in this conversation because my primary approach is that this is not a security issue. It's sort of, it has a social, cultural context that we don't talk about at all. But if I say this out loud, I'm quite often accused of not taking it seriously or being Putin's troll, for example. So.
Can I ask a follow-up question before we end?
Yeah.
Okay. I think like something that concerns me right now is that people are so hungry for any sort of tech regulation that they're accepting these terrible regulations.
Yeah.
I'm speaking with legislators. They are doing nothing with what I'm saying to them. So what do we do as a community to push back against some of these bad bills?
That's the question you wanted to ask before we end.
That's your job. Host a symposium at Duke and we're gonna
I don't know, Robin. I mean, I think it's it is the question to ask. I think that a lot of I think you can trace the history of people who study content moderation and what to do with it. You can see the history of it as people kind of I don't know, complexifying the issue, right? So 10 years ago, it seemed like a pretty simple issue to regulate content. And then you have people like Mary Greer or Sarah Roberts writing about what it means to be a content regulator and what it means to moderate content and how that's, you know, how it's very complicated. And then you have a movie like Social Dilemma, which puts us back, right? I mean, so it's like an uneven path, but I think that we have to reject, and this gets to what you're pointing out, as scholars, we need to reject some of the language that we're using to regulate content. Even me saying regulate content, and I don't know how to do that, but I do think that we're operating in a limited way because we have a limited vocabulary for what we're talking about and how we have to address it. And we are humans and we are scholars, lots of us are scholars of cultural anthropology or communication. We can make shit up, you know? And I mean this by like in the best possible generative way, like we made this, we can unmake it, right? And so I think that that's, you know, a way to just to kind of keep pushing at changing the vocabulary.
Well,
Oh, I want to just add one sentence onto that because I think also the most important, that's totally agree. And I also think that one of the reasons that we know the problem that you're talking about, Robin, is that there's all these people studying this and disinformation who are like, we have to start a field. This is this new thing. And it's like, whoa, hold on. No, right? Like, we've been saying media studies and
Yeah.
communication and culture anthropology, and so having that history embedded in it, that this is just the new media that we're having a more panic about, helps, I think, solve some of that problem, but I think,
Mhm.
and to Pranav's point, talking to people in the language they can understand to be a part of that conversation, right? To say like, hello, there's a field, right? Or several related fields, that do already address this, I think is part of like what we can do to make that work more smoothly. Thank you for letting me jump in.
Well, fair to say, we just ended on a strong note. Thank you, everyone. And I don't know if we have a closing remark or not.
On to the next symposium that we're hosting, religion, media, and public life.
Thanks, everyone.